Ohai. Bukhara. One of the most ancient cities of Central Asia, the administrative center of the Bukhara region of Uzbekistan. The real architectural and historical and cultural reserve which kept unique monuments of architecture of all historical eras since 9th century. In the developed Middle Ages it was the center of culture, science and Muslim theology of all Middle East. Bukhara, the only city of Central Asia whose before and early Islamic history was in detail described in the known work Nurshaki, the historian living in the 10th century. Throughout centuries the city didn't change the location and was the center of the possession Bukhara, the capital of the states of Samanadav, Shabanadav, Ashtarkhanadav, Mangatov and Bukharskoye of the People's Soviet Republic. Throughout many centuries Bukhara played a role of the large administrative, trade and craft and cultural center of Central Asia. Through the city there passed one of routes of the Great Silk Way connecting the countries of the Mediterranean to the Far East. Bukhara, as well as throughout centuries, remained some kind of Mecca for the Central Asian Muslims. Numerous mazara, places of worship, attracted a huge number of pilgrims. The famous scientist theologians lived in the city, strengthening her glory as center of Muslim divinity. In 1925 in Bukhara there passed the Uzbekistan Constituent Kurultai of Councils, at which the Declaration on Creation of the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic was adopted. Etymology. The toponym Bukhara is for the first time mentioned on early copper coins of Bukhara with the Sud inscriptions. The 4-5 centuries assume that the word Bukhara has Eftalitsky origin. In written sources the word Bukhara is for the first time noted by the Chinese scientist and the translators Wanzang. 602-664. Under one of the assumptions, Bukhara in the ancient time called all oasis, and probably only in the 10th century his name was final as postponed for the city. In Drevnyougriski language the word meant temple, chapel. The historian and the philologist of the 11th century Mahmud of Kashgaria notes that the name of the city of Bukhara comes from the name of the temple of idolaters. There are other assumptions under which the toponym of Bukhara reflects the Sud word Buhark, the happy place, and on which the word Bukhar in language of the Persian priests magicians means the center of learning or monastery of knowledge. Former names. The historian of the 10th century of Nurshaki is from Bukhara, writes that any city had no so many names as Bukhara. The city is for the first time mentioned in the Chinese sources of the 5th century as Naimi, in whom there was a residence of the governor of the possession of the same name. In the 7th century in Chronicles of the Empire of Tan his name it is mentioned in the following forms: Ansi, Buko, Bak, Thumped and Fuko. Is later in Arabic the city was mentioned in old books and manuscripts under different names. Buyumiskat, Madinat experts Afriya. Copper City. Madinat at-Tashar, Numids. In one of hadiths from the Prophet Muhammad, Fakira and others. Among these names the name Bukhara was the most popular. From 1888 to the 1940th years Bukhara in documents appeared as Old Bukhara after the basis Nova Bukhari. History. The city arose in the middle of the I millennium BB. The age of Bukhara proved by researchers exceeds 2500. According to the local mythical tradition reflected in the history of Bukhara, Nurshaki, the basis of the most ancient part of the fortified city of the Ark, treats an extreme antiquity, and it is attributed to heroes of the epos Sayavashar. However, ancient Bukhara, the large strengthened settlements Vardhanzi, Ramtin, Varaksha and the trade city of Paykend were considered. This city was created along one of large inflows of the Zarafshana river, which breaks up here to several canals, on the low marshy plain, over which and nowadays the massive artificial hill of a city citadel, the Ark Towers. The city throughout more 2000 didn't change the location that, on the one hand, led to accumulation of powerful occupation layers of various historical eras, and with another, led to destruction of many monuments and traces of the previous time. Today an ancient part of Bukhara survives the city which kept initial structure. However, conditions for life and construction were extremely limited here. Flat boggy plain, unstable water mode and poor resources. The occupation layer in the territory of the city makes more than 20 meters. At such depth, archaeologists found the remains of residential and public buildings, wherein coins, instruments of labor and jewelry which are dated 5th century BB. Unlike Samarkand, groundwaters, close to a surface, didn't allow archaeologists to reach the lowermost layer. The most ancient artifacts testifying to time of the basis of Bukhara are hidden by powerful groundwaters, therefore the true age of the city demands further studying. In the 4th century BB, the territory of the future the Arch of Bukhara is led round by a rather mighty fortification with a wide ditch, and at his bottom also strengthened settlement of the dispersed planning is located. On one hypothesis, Bab's fortress, the unapproachable place on border between the Sud-Earth and Scythians, Massagetum, was at the place of Bukhara, mentioned by Arrian in connection with Alexander of Macedon's campaign. In the ancient time, Bukhara was one of the main towns of Sogda. In the 6th century BB, the city was occupied by the Persian dynasty Achaemenidov, and in 329 BB, Alexander of Macedon, during whom the town planning structure was developed. The population of these lands didn't reconcile to conquerors and showed them persistent resistance. Domination of Greeks in Sogdiana continued till 2nd century BB. During the subsequent era there is a steady growth of this settlement, which turned into rather big city and became the trade and craft and administrative center of all Bukhara oasis. Since the end of the 1st century BB into a half of the 4th century, Bukhara was a part of the Kashansky state. In the 5th century, Bukhara was a part of the state of Eftalit, the Eftalitsky kingdom, which capital was a trade city of Paykend located in 40 kilometers from Bukhara. Between 563–567 years near Bukhara there was a bloody battle between Eftalita led by Gadifer and Astemikhagan's Turkic peoples. In an 8-day fight of an Eftalita were broken. In the 5th–6th centuries, ancient governors minted own coins with the image of a portrait of the Tsar and the Sud inscription, Sovereign Aspar, that is, the head of a cavalry. According to an authoritative Sogdialogue of 5a. Lifshits in the Sud sources of the 4–8th century Sogdiates called only Samarkandites and Pensacondites, but not Bukharites and Keshits. These two groups apparently didn't consider each other as the uniform people. Plashtani noted that authors of early medieval Turkic inscriptions distinguished Sogdites from Bukharites. Thus, Bukharites allocated themselves from other inhabitants of Sog. Data on board a Turek in the ethnopolitical history Sogda belong to the 580th years. In 585-586 years in Bukhara there was a revolt of Abruya who was depressed Turkic prince Lanuz Arslan Sharia Kishvar. After that young Sauk was approved as the possessor of the Bukhara oasis. After in Bukhara in 589-603 years his son governed Nili. Then his son Bayesi 603-604 governed. Fortress of the Ark where governors and their confidants lived was the center of Bukhara. Behind her walls there was actually a city. Construction of a Shakristan of ancient Bukhara and also several settlements in the Bukhara oasis is attributed Sharia Kisara. Shakristan was surrounded by trade and craft suburbs, Rabat. Through Bukhara the Great Silkway lay. There were more than 60 caravanserai where merchants from India, China, Persia and other countries accommodated. In 40 came to the west from the city the settlement of Varaksha where there was a residence of Bukhar Kudat, known for the wall paintings representing scenes of hunting for cheetahs was located. In 603-658 years Bukhara was one of the Sud possessions submitting to the West Turkic Khaganate. Possessors were called as Bukharkadata at this time. 1. Smirnova considered the Turkic governors of the Bukhara oasis in the middle of the 8th century let out group of the Tierkosad coins with an inscription of Lord Hakan of Adeng. In the ancient time Bukhara and its districts were surrounded with a big defensive wall Kanparak. In the city there were 5 rows of walls and the channel with water. The palace had a flat roof. The throne of the prince represented a gold camel and in height was 7'8", 2.5-3 m. The princess participated in formal receptions and sat opposite to the husband facing him. 3 officials knew affairs. Customs resembled Kangusti, but also there were also closely related marriages. Possibly influence of Zoroastrianism. At Swiindi in Bukhara, there arrived the ambassador Duzingman, who brought 5 colored salt from there, and had a vassal state of Bai, where only 1,000 families lived. Before gained by Arabs, Bukhara was the large city and the cultural center of Central Asia. She had economic relations with Persia, India, China and other countries. The Arab historians in detail state from now on the history of the city. Bukhara of the time occupied the space about 30-35 hectares. Her center was in the area modern current Sargaran. This part carried the name, the internal city, and was walled with 7 gates. Only during the Muslim period connected to the suburb to one city, and for the first time, as Narshaki testifies, it was enclosed with the general wall in 849 that marked itself final registration her as the cities. To the west from Asia Kristana settled down the Ark, or as it at the time was called, before gained by Arabs lived in Bukharkadata. Bukhara was captured by Arabs in 709, under leadership of the commander Qutayb ibn Muslim, and a half of Asia Christian was divided by him between Arabs and Yemenites. In the city there was a Christian church subsequently turned into the mosque. The contemporary Qutayb, Ayyub ibn Hassan, was the first Arab emir of Bukhara. With the arrival of Arabs in the 8th century in Bukhara, Islam extended. From now on, mosques and minarets, madrasa and cult complexes began to be built. Blossoming of the city began when Bukhara was elected the capital of the state of Samanadav at Ismail Samani, 892-907. The appearance of the city sharply changed. Considerably the population increased. Bukhara in the 10th century was already developed city from all directions, surrounded with craft and trade rabada. Shakristan still continued to be allocated. The wall surrounding and protecting it was supported, gate remained. It is known that Samanida decorated the capital with monumental and effective buildings of palaces, government agencies, mosques and madrasa. At them, between the western high facade, the arch and a wall of Rabat, arose the square Registan, the administrative center of the city, the palace with the portal which aristocracy recognized the most majestic in the countries of Islam was built here. Here too there were sofas, the main departmental institutions. Near Registan palaces, the houses of an imperial surname. In the area Dui Mulian, differing in big luxury, were located. However, not defined the nature of the city during this era. Formation of the city was connected with education and development of Rabat. Certain territories of Rabat were walled. Besides, all territory of the city was protected by the fortification, which had 11 gates. His state was interested in development of city life and production forces of the city, and sought to create for this condition, first of all having ensured safety of its inhabitants. Today, except happily survived dynastic mausoleum Samanadav in the city on the earth's surface, didn't remain any construction of this time. According to Es-Salibi, Bukhara at Samanadak was monastery of glory, a dominion Kaaba, the place of collecting of outstanding people of an era. On a response of the geographer Stokri, I was the most populous city in Transoxiana and Khorasan. If to trust Muqaddasi, in Bukhara there were no tax collectors. This results from the fact that at the end of the 10th century residents of the capital were exempted from taxes. Writes Muqaddas. Inhabitants enjoy justice of the Sultan and also prosperity, stay in confidence. About Bukhara, Muqaddasi took out contradictory impressions. According to him, this city is blessed, for this purpose someone aspires in him, vivifying, for this purpose someone lives in him, kind to the one someone lives in him. In him foods pleasant, both baths tidy and streets wide, and fresh waters and constructions charming. He kind in livelihood and accommodation, plentiful fruit and majlisa, meetings. The simple people have knowledge of fiqh, jurisprudence, and literature. At the same time, the narrowness and density of urban development. The closest of the cities of the East. The frequent fires, adverse climate, hot, cold, is noted. Development in Bukhara of craft and trade made it the important economic center. Narshak are described by the developed commodity production of the fabrics differing in high quality. According to him, in one city of Khorasan weren't able to weave such good matters. The Bukhara fabrics of Azandanacha served as an export subject. To Bukhara there came dealers and took out matters to Sham, Egypt and the city of Ruma from here. Art of the Bukhara masters was an imitation subject. Bukhara left to Khorasan, unsuccessfully trying to arrange their production of so-quality fabrics which willingly used the upper class. There was no Zah, the Emir, Reza, the official who wouldn't wear clothes from this fabric. Reports Nashik also about a large weavers' institution which was near the cathedral mosque, between Ark and Shakristani. In it especially valuable fabrics which from all Bukhara was paid to give to the Arab Caliph were produced. According to Nurshaki, behind these fabrics from the capital of the Caliphate of Baghdad annually there came the special official. In the 10th century Bukhara became the center of high culture. Here many scientists, world-renowned, writers and artists worked, such as historian Nurshaki, poets Rudaki and Dakiki, physician, mathematician and Ibn Zing's encyclopedist Avicenna, historians Balajuri, Tabari, Miscavi and others. These scientists made a big contribution to development of world science and culture. In Bukhara the madrasa in which the medicine was taught worked. It was some kind of medical school where the youth was trained in the medical theory and practice with an obligatory passing the final exams and acceptance of an oath of the doctor. Such madrasas were also in Samarkand and in Merv. Current Stalpakurashan was in the place of a dome, a book fair on which the dome was called Current Skatafurashan. Here different books and manuscripts were on sale. In the city there was a library, huge on the time. In the autobiography of Ibn Crossing left us her description. In library there were catalogues, special storages for books. In the first third of the 12th centuries Karakanidski governors built up a number of buildings in Bukhara. Nasser is Scarlet Mulk. Ibrahim 1068-1080. And you built up the burned down cathedral mosque with a minaret between fortress and Shakristani, Shamsabad with magnificent buildings near Bukhara, based the large garden on the southern gate Ibrahim. In Karakanidski time in Bukhara by the invitation of a Karakanid of Shams of Labama of a Mulk sometime the outstanding poet and the scientist Omar Khayyam worked. Later Kader Henjabrail. Tobril Tejan Umar. I died in 1102. Built up around markets of Attar and of Madrasa Kalartakin and was buried in her. From an era Karakanid of ancient monuments in the city remained. Minaret Kalayan, mosques Magokiatari and Namaz, mausoleums Chashmayab and Turkey Jindi. Quarter and Sufi center. In 1119 on Namaz's basis Shams's Scarlet Mulk built up the new building of the festive mosque which remained in the reconstructed look up to now. During an era Karakanadav at board of Arslan Hanna, 1102-1130, was constructed one of masterpieces of the Bukhara architecture, a minaret Kalyan, 1127-1129. In his southwest part of the internal city, he redeemed the residential quarter and built up the Friday Mosque. It is finished in 1121. Known nowadays as the Mosque Kalyan here. Construction activity of the Turkic governor Arslan Hanna Muhammad Suleiman surpassed achievements of predecessors. Besides palaces, he built baths and madrasa, strengthened city walls. One more mosque was at small distance to the south from the Mosque Kailan. Now houses in one of them, Arslan Hanna, are at her place. In the 12th century, the Bukhara oasis becomes one of the centers of Sufism in Central Asia. Abdulhalik Gidzuvani was one of the known Sufi of this period. In 1141 Bukhara was captured by Karakate, and at the beginning of the 13th century it was a part of the state of Khorramshahr. In 1206 in the city there was a revolt led by Malik Sanzar. It was suppressed troops of a Khorramshahr Scarlet Muhammad's Heldines. 1200-1220. In February 1220 Bukhara was captured by troops of Genghis Khan, who drove on a horse to the cathedral mosque of the city. The city was plundered, and inhabitants are taken away in captivity for the help to Mongols at storm of Samarkand. According to the contemporary, came, dug up, burned, beat, took away in bondage, killed and left. Later the city, which entered the Ulis Chagatai, was also exposed to cruel destructions in 1238, 1263 and 1273, 1276. From the second half of the 13th century the city began to be restored gradually. The traveler Italian Marco Polo, who visited at the time Bukhara, called it the city of big greatness. The population nevertheless couldn't reconcile to the difficult situation and often excited rebellions against violence of the Mongolian power. In 1238 in Bukhara there was the anti-Mongolian revolt led by the handicraftsman Mahmud Tarabi, which was cruelly suppressed by Mongols. In 1273 the army Hulagridav was included into Bukhara. Slaughter and robbery, during which the Madrasa Masood Baker burned down, began, and in him there are a lot of handwritten books. The city was ruthlessly plundered and burned by hordes of a Chingyizid of the Abacus Khan. The last ruin of Bukhara and oasis by Mongols of the Hulagidsky Ulis happened in the fall of 1316. It is no wonder that Ibn Battuta, passing through Bukhara in 1333, wrote, "Now his mosques, madrasa and markets in ruins, except for the few." In the 1360th years in Bukhara, under the influence of Khurasan, the democratic movement of Surbadar arose. In the second half of the first half of the 14th century, the Mongolian nobility begins to accept Islam, and some of her representatives become murida of Sufi sheikhs. Among them there was such famous sheikh of Bukhara as Sayyid Bocharsi's Heldines. In the 13th century in Bukhara and the area adjoining to it, the Sufi doctrine violently develops. Sufi Sayyid Bukharsi was sent to Bukhara by the mentor Horomitsi Nazm ad-Din Kubra, where the sheikh lived about 40 years. In Bukhara the sheikh held a foreground, enjoyed popularity among the population and a great influence at the Mongolian governors. There were Mudarisi, also Mutawal, the manager of Vakufni, means of one of large spiritual schools, the Madrasa of Hanai, destroyed by Mongols in 1273-1276. The deputy of Mongols, Evaresmiats Masudbek, sought to restore the system of madrasa and based in Bukhara a Ironu, from which it should be noted Madrasa of Masada, where about 1,000 students studied. Also, Abdulhalik Gidzuvani and Bakhadin Naqshband were the famous representatives of the Sufi doctrine of the Mongolian era. In times Timurid of Bukhara was small as at Timuridak the city had no the taking priority situation as earlier at Karakaniak later at Shaybanadak. The secretary Timur Hafizi Abra describes Nis Bukhara era Samanadav, and about the modern city shortly reports to him. Though now, in comparison with last times, there is no 10th part left also, but in comparison with other known cities of Bukhara for the fertility and peaceful prosperity can be called a paradise garden. Nevertheless, at the time of Timur, 1370-1405, government and Timurid of Bukhara remained one of the most important centers of craft and trade. Islam Dome, a pilgrimage in the homeland of influential representatives of Sufi clergy. During an era Timurid of Bukhara became the sacred city and the center for Muslims. At this particular time Bukhara began to be called Bukhara Sharif. The greatest Bukhara, sacred Bukhara. In the city a few buildings of this time remained. On behalf of Timur the Mosque Namots was repaired, the cathedral Mosque Kailan is restored and the Hanaka on a necropolis Hazrat Imam is built. A certain Amir Hafiz over an ancient shrine built up the mausoleum Chashmayap. Bukhara Rui Gonzalez de Clavijo, the ambassador of Castile mentioned in the diary, coming back in the fall of 1404 with embassy to Great Timur home. Arrived in the big city called Boyers, Bukhara. It lies on the extensive plain and it is surrounded with an earth shaft and a deep ditch filled with water. On his one end, fortress earth is in this earth there is no stone to do fencings and walls, near fortress proceeded the river. At the city the considerable suburb, and their big buildings. The city is rich with bread, meat, wine and other food and many goods. In this city envoys received everything that it was necessary for them, and there they were given horses. At a turn of the 14th, 15th centuries known the Bukhara Muhammad Pasha of Hajiz Sufia, Bakadan Naqshband's pupil, built up in Bukhara a Hanak, a bath, madrasa. I based a big market of Hajj. In his madrasa the huge library in which books and manuscripts were collected, the earliest, was located the 12th century. Shakrak Mirza often consulted on the Bukhara Sheikha in particular, from Haj Muhammad Parsa. Mind. In 1420. For the structure of affairs of Muslims. Ulugh had a special relation to Bukhara. In the spring of 1405 after Timur's death in anticipation of intestine fight for a throne, Ulugh and Ibrahim the Sultan with the treasury and trustees went to Bukhara and stopped in the fortress of the Ark. Here they for a month were engaged in strengthening of walls and gate of the city. Later Shakrak. 1404-1447. Appointed Ulugh the deputy of Transoxiana with the capital city of Samarkand and the second most important, Bukhara. In the fall of 1417 at Ulugh Bukhara it was enriched with the building of new madrasa, nowadays being the oldest of remained in Central Asia. However Ojbegim occupied with continuous campaigns, reception of ambassadors and also mourning in connection with the death of the wife to see him personally as the customer of construction, he could only in November, 1419. This madrasa became famous thanks to an inscription on a shutter of gate. Aspiration to knowledge, a duty of each Muslim and Muslim. In winter of 1421-1422 Ulugh accepted in Bukhara ambassadors from Tibet.
In 1428-1429 I was engaged here in the structure of mint which provided several decades all Transoxiana with a copper coin.
The former trustee Uligaka, the deputy of Khwarezm Amir Shah Melik, sent him to Bukhara for hunting of the Nukar with gerfalcons. In Bukhara, the subsequent Timuridak from their name ruled Tarkani. Traces of their activity in the city aren't revealed yet. It is known only that heads of Sufi Brotherhood Naqshbandiya Hajj belonged to Baths, income from which came to advantage of the founder, his descendants and on Sadr Zaini madrasas, based by him in Samarkand. With falling of the empire of Timuridov, the scientists and artists who before brought together at the Herat Yard moved to Bukhara. During Board Shaybanid of Bukhara at first stayed in the status of the center of one of destinies, and then the capitals of all state. During an era Shaybanid in Bukhara, tens of new madrasas, mosques, caravanserai, trade domes were constructed. For history, cultures and architecture of Bukhara are of particular importance. Three Khans from this dynasty:
Abidullah Khan, Abdulaziz Khan and Abdullah Khan II.
Bukhara, the capital city of Abidullah Khan. Since 1504, the Supreme Khan in 1533-1540 ruled Bukhara. Was the place of gathering of erudite people. At his life reached such degree that reminded Herat of times of Hussein Bukhara. Ubaydullah Khan was an educated person. I recited the Quran and I supplied him with comments in Turkic language.
Abidullah himself wrote verses in Turkic, Persian and Arab languages under the literary pseudonym Ubaydi.
We were reached by the collection of his poems. From memoirs of the contemporaries who were personally knowing Ubaydi, a pseudonym of the Khan. It was the outstanding person of the era. Cultural level hardly conceded him to the level of education of Temuridsky elite. He paid to the library close attention, and, with persistence, was engaged in any studying of sciences and knowledge, observing religious duties.
Since 1512 in Bukhara at court of Ubaydullah there lived the famous scientist Fazlullah ibn Uzbekistan Isfakhani, who in 1514 wrote for him the book Suluk is Skanad Mulak.
Rules of conduct of sovereigns. The son of Ubaydullah Khan, Abdulaziz Khan. Since 1533 the Bukhara Khan in 1540-1550 ruled Bukhara. Was an uncommon person also. According to the contemporary Azizi, a pseudonym of the Khan. I was a patron of scientists and poets. Nicely I wrote Nasi and I was engaged in versification.
The well-known Bukhara Library, the center of court cultural life, played a big role in formation of the Bukhara and Samarkand school of the art. Later used special attention and protection of the Khan.
She had an impact of Mavernaksky school of tiny painting. During Board Abdulaziz Khan reconstruction of the city began. Especially well it is traced around ancient markets of Bukhara where the mosque Magokiatari connected by the highway with an architectural complex current Seraphin was reconstructed. The city reached the blossoming at board of a Shibbanid Abdullah Khan II. 1557-1598. Abdullah Khan II wrote verses and Yavaz Hazi left the heritage under a pseudonym. Abdullah Khan was also a patron of education and the patron surrounded himself with scientists, writers and chroniclers. Considerable attention was paid by him to construction. The city up to the middle of the 19th century didn't go beyond the fortification constructed in the 16th century, and at the same time contained in itself more than 200 madrasas and a set of markets. Court poets and historians eulogized him. Mashfiqi, the author of laudatory odes, lyrics and epigrams, who was also a capable diplomat, was the famous poet. On an assignment, Abdullah Khan Mashfiqi made grandiloquent inscriptions for constructions. The court historian Hafiz Tanish made the chronicle Abdullah name rich with the facts. Literature continued to develop on Persian, Central Asian Turkic and partially on Arab languages. According to the Academician 5. V. Bartold, historical literature at Uzbeks on quality and quantity stood even above than in former centuries. The historian of the 16th century Muhammad Yar ibn Arab Katagan, who wrote the work Music Here is Scarlet Violet, Conquest of the Countries, was the famous native of the Uzbek tribe of Katagan. In the work The Story Shibanidav, including an era Abdullah Khan is told. The modern look but the city at the time of dynasties Shaybanidav and Ashtar-Khanadav in the 16th, 17th centuries, when the majority of his mosques and madrasa, caravanserai and baths, fortifications and gate, and also large architectural complexes and tombs were built.
The city didn't go beyond the fortification constructed in the 16th century, and at the same time contained in itself more than 200 madrasas and a set of markets on which it was possible to buy practically everything.
So far walls of an ancient citadel, more than 140 architectural monuments of a Muslim era remained. A minaret of Poikalian of the 12th century, Madrasa Kukuldash and Ulagaka of the 11th, 16th centuries, Liabi House of the 16th, 17th centuries, Ismail Samani's mausoleum, the 9th, 10th centuries.
In the remained monuments, lines of local original architectural school and skill of the Bukhara architects accurately are traced.
Bukhara is considered one of the sacred cities of Sufism. In the city many great Sufi saints stayed. One of the most esteemed, Bukhara Naqshband, whose mausoleum is considered the Central Asian Mecca and is not on a dalyoka from the city. Imam Quli Khan, 1611-1642. Was Muradi Jubarski Qad Hadina of a Hadha, which was married to younger sister of Imam Quli Khan. On the square Regist and Haji Tadzuddin constructed Madrasa of Arash Shifo. This madrasa had medical specialization, drugstore and medical institution. 10000 rare books were stored in library of this madrasa. Annually here 800 big glass vessels of pink water and other drugs intended for various diseases prepared. In 1619-1620, at the expense of the uncle and the closed dignitary Imam Quli Khan, an Nader Sofa, run in Bukhara, the Hanaka was constructed. She formed with the madrasa of Noda Divanbedi, located opposite, which enters into ensemble of La Abi House. In 1622-1623 Nader Sofa, run the monumental building as a caravanserai was built, but further it was converted in madrasa and it is known as Madrasa of Noda Divanbedi. At Bod Abdulaziz Khan in Bukhara, the madrasa of his name, Madrasa Valide Abdulaziz Khan, were constructed. He brought together library from beautiful manuscripts. Ashtarkhanid Subkhan Quli Khan was the author of several works on medicine and astrology. His work on medicine was written in the Central Asian Turkic language. One of lists of the manuscript is stored in library in Budapest. Subkan Kulihan was also fond of poetry and wrote verses under the pseudonym Nashoni. Ashtarkanad Abdullahan of 2 in 1709 to the west from Bukhara. Mayor Gate Talapak. With the large garden, among which I built the palace.
The garden was filled with different fruit and decorative trees and flower beds, enclosed with a high wall.
It received the name Hanabad, constructed by the Khan. Imam Abdullah most of all liked to spend time. In the period of Board of Ubaydullah Hana, the two famous historians were Abdurrahman and Tali, and the world Muhammad Amin and Bukhari. In the first half of the 18th century, Bukhara, as well as the whole country, was in a condition of an economic crisis. In 1740 the city appeared in the power of the Iranian Shah Nader Shah. From the second half of the 18th century, Bukhara, thanks to the politician Muhammad of Rakam, 1756-1758, and Shah Murad, 1785-1800, gradually leaves crisis state. At the beginning of the 19th century, the city returned the former status of the center of Islamic religion. In Bukhara, tens of madrasas in which students from the different countries of the Islamic world studied were restored.
At Uzbekistan, several thousands of dervishes on Thursdays and revivals went to Bukhara for collecting a hand-up. In the 1770 years, the Russian Empress Catherine the Great, as a sign of a friendly relationship, presented to the Bukhara ambassador Ernazar Maksudbek 1,000 rubles.
On these means, subsequently in Bukhara, the madrasa called in honor Ernazar Alchi was constructed. It was from the western part of Madrasa Kukuldash and existed to the middle of the 50th years of the 20th century. The madrasa was destroyed at the initiative of the Soviet authorities. Nowadays on his place the square is located. In the middle of the 19th century in Bukhara, for the first time in the history of the city hours on a wall the arch were determined. In days of the Soviet power they were lost. In 1868 the Bukhara Emirate got to vassal dependence to the Russian Empire and received the status of her protectorate. To the Emir Muzaffar a number of embassies were sent. Nosevich, Kostenko and Petrovsky. Ceremonials of reception of ambassadors were made in Uzbek.
Ceremonister shouted.
Kyude Hazrati Emirni Muzaffar Mansakilson. God, yes, will make the great Emir powerful and victorious. By some estimates, in 1910 the population of Bukhara totaled Kurd people. In the city there were 364 mosques, 2 synagogues, more than 50 markets. At the end of the 19th and first 2 decades of the 20th centuries in the city there was a construction boom as which donatives acted, generally the merchants building or repairing quarter mosques, madrasa, caravanserai, defining them in waf of the madrasas. The frame of the so-called Bukhara Jadidism was made by natives of the most Bukhara Emirate, generally representatives of the intellectuals, in Mulavacha, pupils of madrasa, and recently ended training in madrasa, merchants and dealers, and also handicraftsmen. The Bukhara Jadids, as well as all intellectuals, freely knew Farsi language. The educator Ahmad Danish was the founder of the reformatory movement in Bukhara, the Bukhara Dadid. In 1908 the Bukhara Jadids created the Bukhara Sharif of Asia Kota organization, which generally was engaged in the edition, printing and sale of books and textbooks in the territory of the Bukhara Emirate. The most famous representatives of the Bukhara Jadidism are Abdurrauf Fitrat, Faisal Hadhayev, Osman Hadhayev, Abdulkadir Makitdinov, Mousa Saidzanov. Soviet period. Bukhara had a reputation for the city of poverty, where life stopped at the level of the gloomy Middle Ages. However, actually, this representation was far from reality. Till 1920 in Bukhara there were several banks and representative offices of overseas trading houses. There was a brisk trade connecting Bukhara with world business centers. On September 2, 1920, Raqqa led by M5 Franz as a result of three-day storm captured Bukhara. At storm of the city 10 bombers were involved. As a result of storm and bombing of Bukhara, the most part of residential quarters of the city was destroyed. The Bukhara Emir Said Alam Khan fled the city and the country to Afghanistan, and the Bukhara Emirate stopped the existence. At the end of 1920 the accounting of destructions caused by overthrow of the Emirate was made. In the territory of 27 craft city quarters, the Gusar stretched from the ceremonial square Regist into a minaret Kalan especially affected by bombing. 9 mosques and 582 houses, including several office buildings, were destroyed. Also 850 benches and workshops, 38 caravanserai, stables and 38 bakeries were destroyed. The fortification was broken. Not only many palace rooms in Ars were destroyed, but also the buildings bordering Regist completely disappeared. Huge 2-story Madrasa Buzori Gusvant. 1670. An ancient stocky clinic of Dorui Shifo. 1697. Usturukis Hanaka Madrasa Shadi Bai. The 17th century. Hajjaz Madrasa Nikhol, the mosque Pa and Bayatalik. With 3 low portals on a facade. The market domes of Toki Turgan and Toki Ord located nearby, many cult buildings. Near the main city pool of La Abihas. Sating the city disappeared. There is no stone left on a stone, and from big 2-storied Madrasa Kalibad. 1600. And even such original buildings as Chormina, lost all structures of ensemble. It was filled up with garbage and revetted with 1 stone plates in the middle of the yard. Costs having been deserted, only a portico with 4 minarets. Many monuments of architecture were destroyed because of carelessness of tenants or negligence of researchers, which left the trenches dug by them not filled up. The open bases perished in the face of guardians of the city. So, the trenches dug during excavation at walls of Madrasa of Miri the Arab were filled up not at once, and in Madrasa Abdullah Khan too the crack split his portal from top to bottom. On September 14 were formed Bukharski Revolutionary Committee led by Abdulkadir Makitdinov and Council of National Nazar. Commissioners led by Faisal Hadhayev. On October 8 the same year Bukhara became the capital of the Bukhara People's Soviet Republic, which in 1924 on national sign was divided between the Uzbek Sur, the Turkmen Sur and Tajik the Asar. On February 13, 1925 in Bukhara the I Congress of Councils of Workers, where the declaration on formation of the Uzbek Sur and its entry into structure of the Asar as the Federal Republic was adopted took place. Since January 15, 1938, the city was the center of the Bukhara region of Uzbekistan. In 1990, at the initiative of one Karimov, the Bukhara State Medical Institute was founded.
In 1993, the historic center of the city of Bukhara was included in the list of the cities of the World Heritage UNESCO.
UNESCO announced Bukhara the capital of Islamic culture of 2020. The population of the city, as of January 1, 2014, was 272,500 inhabitants. 1841, 6000070000. 1917, Modern card. 1939, 59000. 1959, 69000. 1970, card. 1985, card. 2014, 272,500. According to official data, the population is made mainly by Uzbeks -82%, also in the city live the Russian -6%, Tajiks -4%, Tatars -3%, Koreans -1%, Turkmens -1%, Ukrainians -1% and others -2%. Most of the population practices Islam, also Orthodox Christians, Jews and others live in Bukhara. The population of Bukhara throughout modern card year history of the city developed continuously, changing and mixing up with alien groups.
The most ancient local inhabitants were Sogdites, whose language is considered the dead and treats almost disappeared northeast subgroup of the Iranian languages.
And clear to carriers of other groups. The first census on national sign in the city of Bukhara was conducted in 1926. From 41823 rewritten inhabitants to 77823 persons defined themselves as Uzbeks, 8646 as Tajiks, and 5354 carried themselves to other people. In Bukhara the Uzbeko-Tajik bilingualism prevails. In the period of the Soviet power, almost all population of the city began to carry itself to Uzbeks not only in civil sense, but also in ethnic.
Interesting results were received as a result of a series of expeditions 1940, the 1950th years under the leadership of O.A.
Sukhareva, which were engaged in particular in studying of ethnic and language structure of the population of Bukhara. In settled population Bukharites, as well as other city groups of the population of Central Asia, used the name of residence. Bukharites, Samarkandites, Tashkentites and other.
The separate groups of the population consisting in relationship with families of note used an intra-ethnic self-identification of the name of childbirth.
Often former Uzbek tribes. Residents of the neighboring villages, irrespective of communication language, carried themselves to the Uzbek tribes. Sheds and other sites. The city is rich with historical monuments of architecture, then there are about 140 architectural complexes of Poykalian, Lyabi House, Kaukashan, Shorbaka, Tashmashit, the Mausoleum Samanidov and others are the best models of creations of medieval architects of the 11th, 17th centuries. In Bukhara also the set of monuments of inhabited architecture and palaces, baths and trade constructions remained. Transport. In Bukhara there are numerous bus routes. In 1986-2005 in the city trolleybuses worked. Airport. In 2011 the new modern terminal which has one runway was constructed and connects the city with Tashkent, Urgench, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Krasnodar and Novosibirsk. Sport. In the city there is a football club of the highest league of Uzbekistan, Bukhara. Also far. Write comments. Read comments. Interesting people will tell interesting stories. All of good mood and good luck.